Chapter 41. Since the commencement of our travels, and I had passed through so many phases of wonder and surprise that I had thought nothing could startle me anymore, or excite a feeling of astonishment. But when I behold those two letters, cut 300 years ago, I stood there in a state of bewilderment akin to idiocy. Not only was the signature of the great alchemist before my eyes, but his stylet was in my hands. It would only be an unbeliever indeed who could doubt the existence of the traveler and the reality of his travels. While these thoughts were racking in my brain, the professor went off into dithyrambics on Arsenicism. "Wonderful genius!" he cried. "You neglected nothing that you could open other mortals the channels through the earth's crust, and your fellow men can follow your traces. After 3 centuries in the depths of these dark caves, you have done everything to enable others to behold these marvels. Your name, engraved from stage to stage, is an unfailing guide to anyone bold enough to tread in your footsteps, and I believe your autograph will be found at the center of our planet. Well, I too will write my name on this last passage of granite. But henceforth this cape discovered by you near the sea shall be called Cape Saknussemm." That is the substance of what I heard, and my own enthusiasm was rising with words. Fire seemed to burn in my breast. I forgot everything, the dangers of the voyage and the perils of the return. What another had done I would dare, and nothing appeared to me impossible. "Forward! Forward!" I exclaimed. As I spoke, I sprang forward toward the dark gallery, when the professor, usually so prone to hasty action, restrained me, and advised coolness and patience. "First, let us go back to Hans," he said. "Bring back the raft round this point." I obeyed with a bad grace, and hastened to the beach. "Uncle," I said, "do you know the circumstances have been very much in our favor up to now?" "Do you think so, Axel?" "I do. Why, everything, even the storm, combined to set us in the right track. Blessings in the hurricane. It landed us on the very coast from which the fine weather would have carried us far away. Just fancy if a raft with a pro, and had touched the southern shore of the Lindenbrock Sea. What would had become of us? The name Saknussemm would have never greeted our eyes. We should have been wandering the shore without an outlet." "Yes, Axel, there is some providential guidance which brought us going to the south, back to the north, to Cape Saknussemm. I may say it is more than astonishing, and there is something that baffles my sagacity to explain." "What does it matter?" I said. We do not need to account for facts, only to make the most of them." "Certainly, my boy, but we are going to northward again. We shall pass the northernmost countries in Europe. Sweden, Russia, Siberia, who knows? Instead of penetrating under the deserts of Africa or the waves of the ocean, and what more do we know? Yes, Axel, you are right, and it is all for the best, as we shall leave this horizontal sea, which can lead nowhere. We shall go down, always down. Do you know that before we reach the center, we only have 4,500 miles to travel?" "Ah," I said, "that is not worth mentioning. Let us start at once." We talked on this mad tone till we returned to the Hunter. Everything was ready for an immediate start. Every package was on board. We took our stations on the raft, and the sail being hoisted, Hans steered for Cape Saknussemm, following the coastline. The wind was not very favorable to a craft that could not sail very close. In some places, we had to resort to poles to assist our progress. Often low, submerged rocks compelled us to go far out our course. At last, after about 3 hours of navigation, that is, at 6 o'clock in the evening, we reached the point that offered a good landing. I leaped on shore, followed by my uncle and the Icelander. A short passage had not calmed my spirits. On the contrary, I proposed burning our ship, to cut off all temptation to retreat. My uncle would not hear of it. I thought him very lukewarm. At any rate, let us lose no time in starting, I said. Yes, said my uncle, but as a preliminary, we must examine this new gallery, to ascertain whether we must prepare our ladders. My uncle got ready his room-cough apparatus. The raft, fastened to the shore, was left alone, and the mouth of the gallery was not 20 paces off, and our little party bent their steps thither, myself leading the way. The almost circular ending was about 5 feet in diameter. The dark tunnel was hollowed out of the living rock and carefully cleared the eruptive matter which it had once formed out the outlet, so that we could enter without difficulty. He followed an almost horizontal direction, when, after about 6 paces, our progress was cut short by an enormous block of stone. I uttered an exclamation of which was not a blessing which I found myself, stopped an immeasurable obstacle. In vain I searched to which the right and left, above and below. There was no passage, no outlet. I was bitterly disappointed. I would not allow the reality of the obstacle. I bent down, looked under the block, not a chink. Above the granite barrier, Hans passed the lamp along every part of the wall, but found no solution to the difficulty. We had no alternative but to abandon all hope of passing. I had seated myself on the ground. My uncle strode up down the passage. "What did Saknussemm do?" I exclaimed. "Yes," said my uncle. "Was he baffled by this stone barrier too?" No, I said with a warmth. "This rocky fragment must have suddenly closed the passage, set in motion by the same shock, or by those magnetic phenomena which disturb the crust of the earth. Many years have gone by since the return of Saknussemm and the fall of that block. There can be no doubt that this gallery was a channel of her lava, and that the eruptive matters had free circulation. Look, there are recent fissures furrowing the granite roof. That is composed of assemblage of blocks, enormous stones that are arranged as if a giant had toiled to form it. But some sudden shock has displaced the mast, and as if the keystone of the ark had been dislodged, the following stones would have obstructed all passage. It is fortuitous for obstacle which Saknussemm did not encounter, and if we do not remove it, we are unworthy to reach the center of the earth." That was my speech. The soul of the professor had passed into me. The spirit of the discoverer pervaded me. I forgot the past. I disdained the future. Nothing existed for me on the face of our planet, in whose bosom I was plunged. Neither town nor country, neither Hamburg nor Königstrasse, nor my poor Grauben, who must think of me lost forever in the bowels of the earth. "Well," said my uncle, with the mattock and the pickaxe, "let us cut our way. Let us break through this wall." "It is too hard for the pick," I said. "Well, then the mattock. Too tedious. But, well, powder. Let us mine. Let us blow up the barrier." "Powder! Of course," said my uncle. "Hans, set to work at once." The Icelander returned to the raft, and came back with the pickaxe, wherewith to dig a trench for the powder. It was no easy trick. We had to make a hole large enough to contain 50 pounds of gun cotton, whose expensive power was 4 times greater than that of gunpowder. I was in a state of feverish excitement. While Hans was at work, I helped my uncle to prepare a slow match, made of damp powder and a tube of cloth. "We shall pass it," I said. "We shall," said my uncle. At midnight we had finished. The charge of gun cotton was put in, and the slow match was brought along the gallery to the outside. A spark only was wanting to set up this powerful agent in operation. "Tomorrow," said the professor. There was no help for it. I had to resign myself to wait 6 long hours. Chapter 42. The next day, Thursday, August 27th, was a notable day in the subterranean voyage. When I think of it, my heart still beats with terror. From that moment, our reason, our judgment, our ingenuity went for nothing. We were be the playthings of the elements. At 6 o'clock, we were afoot. The moment was at hand. We were to force a passage through the granite crust by means of powder. I begged to be allowed the honor of setting light to the match. That I had done, to rejoin my companions on the raft, which had not been uploaded. Then we intended to sheer off a little, lest explosion should not confine its effects to the interior of the rocky mass. We reckoned the match would take about 10 minutes before reaching the chamber where the powder was. I should therefore have time to regain the raft. I prepared to fulfill my part without trepidation. After a hurried meal, my uncle and the hunter went on board, while I stayed on the beach. I was equipped with a light and lantern, and with which to fire the train. "Go now, my lad," said my uncle, "and come back immediately to us." "Never fear," I said. "I am not likely to loiter on the way." I returned my steps to the entrance of the gallery. I opened my lantern, took up an end of the match, and the professor held his chronometer in his hand. "Ready!" he cried. "Ready! Well, fire, my boy!" I quickly put the match into the flame, which crackled on the contact, and was running as quickly as I could, and I regained the beach. "Jump on board," said my uncle, "and let us push off." Hans made a powerful stroke, impelled us from the land. The raft was about 20 fathoms from the shore. I was exciting. It was an exciting moment. The professor watched us hand of the chronometer. 5 more minutes, he said. 4, 3. My pulse beat twice in a second. 2, 1. Crumble, ye hills of granite! What happened? I do not think I heard the explosion, but the form of the rock seemed to change before my eyes. They opened like a curtain. The unfathomable abyss seemed to open up the shore. The sea seemed so to become drizzy. The only formed one great wave, on whose back the raft rose perpendicularly. We were all thrown down. In less than a second, the light was swallowed up in utter darkness. Presently, I felt our support give away beneath the raft. First, I thought we were falling vertically, but I was mistaken. I thought of speaking to my uncle, but the hoarse roar of waters would have prevented his hearing me. In spite of the darkness, the shock, the emotion, I was able to understand what happened. Beyond the block which we had blown up, there was an abyss, an explosion which had produced a kind of earthquake in this fissured rock, and now the gulf was laid open, and the sea changed into torrent, and was carrying us away into its course. I gave myself up for lost. In about an hour, 2 hours, who knows how much longer passed, we pressed closely together, holding hands so as not to be thrown from the raft. We felt the shocks of great violence when the raft touched the wall, but this was rarely, from which I drew the interface from the gallery that had widened. Beyond a doubt, the passage of Saknussemm, but instead of traveling along by ourselves, we had, by our imprudence, brought the sea along with us. But what will be understood that these ideas passed vaguely and darkly through my mind. It was difficult to think of this giddy journey, which was like a fall. Judging by the wind that lashed on our faces, our pace must have far exceeded that of the most rapid train. To light a torch under these conditions would have been impossible. Our last electric apparatus was broken in the moment of the explosion. My surprise was great. Therefore, at seeing the bright light shine out suddenly beside me, the stolid face of Hans was illuminated. The undaunted hunter had succeeded in lighting the lantern, and although its flame flickered almost to extinction, it threw some gleams into the appalling darkness. The gallery was wide, as I had judged. The faint light did not allow us to perceive both walls at a time. The steepness of the waterfall which carried us off was greater than the great cataracts of America. The surface was like a shower of arrows, launched with the utmost force. No comparison can convey my impression. Sometimes, caught by an eddy, the raft would veer to the right or left in its whirling course. When I had neared the wall of the gallery, I threw my light on the lantern on the rock and could form an estimate of our speed by the fact that the little points of rock seemed to form continuous lines, so that we to be enclosed in a network of moving threads. I judged my speed to be 90 miles an hour. Uncle and I looked to each other with haggard faces as we clung to the butt mass, which was broken at short off at the moment of the catastrophe. We turned our backs to the current of the air, so not to be choked by the rapidity of motion which no human power could slacken. But the hours compressed. The situation was unchanged, except for a complication. In trying to get our cargo in order, we found the greatest part of our stores must have disappeared in the moment of the explosion. When the sea had been so violently agitated, I wanted to know exactly what we had to rely on. The lantern in hand, I began my investigation. Of our instruments, nothing was left but the compass and the chronometer. The ladders and ropes were represented by an end of cable round of the remnant of the mast. Not a pickaxe, nor a mattock, nor a hammer, an irreparable loss. We had provisions only for a day. I searched the interstices of the raft, the crevices formed by the beams of the floor joints. Nothing. Our store consisted of a morsel of dried meat and some biscuits. I stared about me with the stupefied air. I was loath to believe it, and yet what did it matter? If the provisions would have sufficed for months, how were we to escape from the abyss or from the irresistible torrent that was hurrying us down? Why fear the torment of hunger when so many forms of death were presenting themselves? Could we even count on time enough to die in a nation? And yet, by an extraordinary freak of imagination, I overlooked the immediate peril and was overwhelmed with the future, which looked to me so terrible. Besides, it seemed just possible that we might escape the fury of the torrent and regain the surface of the globe. How, I know not. Where, I care not. What matter? A chance is a chance. Even if it is only 1,000, while the death by hunger left us no ray of hope, ever so faint. I thought of telling my uncle and showing him the destruction to which we were reduced, and to show exactly how long we had to live. But I summoned the courage to be silent, though I thought it was best to leave him his self-possession. At this moment, the light of the lantern gradually sank, and then went out. The wick was burned out, and the darkness became absolute. No hope remained of illuminating it. We had a torch left, but it could not be kept alight. So, like a child, I shut my eyes to keep the darkness out. A considerable time elapsed. Then our speed was increased twofold. It went by the current of the air and as it struck my face. The slope of the water became greater and greater. I think we no longer slid. We fell. It was, to my sensations, it was almost vertical descent. My hands of my uncle and of Hans holding fast to my arms held me firmly down. Suddenly, after a period whose duration was quite inappreciable, I felt a kind of shock. The raft had struck nothing solid, but of course was suddenly arrested. A waterspout, an immense liquid column, was falling. I was suffocated. I was drowning. But this sudden flood did not last long. In a few seconds, I was inhaling long breaths of pure air. My uncle and Hans squeezed my arms almost to breaking, and the raft still bore us all three. Chapter 43. I suppose it was now about 10 o'clock at night. The first of my senses that began to act was that of hearing. Strange as the expression may appear, I heard first the silence protruded in the gallery, after roaring which for hours filled my ears. At last I heard my uncle say, in a voice that sounded like a far-off murmur, "We are ascending!" "What do you say?" I cried. "We are ascending, I say." I put out my hand. I touched the wall. My hand was bathed in blood. We were ascending with extreme rapidity. "Now for the torch!" exclaimed the professor. Hans, not without difficulty, succeeded in lighting it, and the flame was able to burn even with ascending motion, and to throw light enough to illuminate the scene. "Just as I thought," said the professor. "We are in a narrow well, not 24 feet in diameter. The water arrived at the bottom of the gulf, regains its level, and we are ascending with it. Whither? I do not know, but we must hold ourselves readiness for any emergency. We are ascending at a rate of 12 feet per second, say 220 per minute, or 9.5 miles per hour. That is the rate we shall make some way. Yes, if nothing stops us, it will. And if the well is an outlet, but if closed, the air will be more and more compressed, and we shall end by being crushed." "Well, Axel," said the professor very calmly, "our situation is all but desperate, but there are chances of salvation, and those I contemplate. We may perish at any moment, but at any moment we may be saved. Therefore, let us be on alert to take advantage of any circumstance. What is there we can do? Recruit our strength by eating." At these words, I glanced sadly at my uncle. At last, we should have to reveal my secret. "Eat?" I said. "Yes, without delay." The professor added some words in Danish. Hans shook his head. "What?" said my uncle. "Our provisions are lost?" "Yes, there is all that remains, a dried piece of meat for the three of us." My uncle looked vacantly at me. "Well," I said, "do you think we may be saved?" The question received no answer. An hour passed. I was suffering the pangs of hunger. My companions suffered also, but none of us would touch the miserable remnant of food. We continued to ascend the extreme rapidity. Sometimes the air cut off our respiration, as happens to aeronauts rising too swiftly, as they experience cold when they rise. We experience, on the contrary, an ever-increasing heat, and this moment it was at certainly we reached 70 degrees. What does this change indicate? Up till now, the facts have confirmed that the theories of Davy and of Lindenbrock. Till now, the peculiar conditions of refractory rocks, electricity, and magnetism had modified the general laws of nature and given us moderate temperature. For the central fire, the Ori still seemed to me the only true or explicable one. Were we hastening toward the medium where these phenomena were developed strictly in accordance with that theory, and which the heat reduced the rocks in a state of fusion? I fear this took of me, and I said to the professor, "If we were neither drowned nor crushed, if the hunger does not put an end to us, that we still have a chance of being burned alive." He merely shrugged his shoulders and relapsed into meditation. An hour passed, and no change saved in the temperature, which kept increasing. At last, my uncle broke the silence. "Come," he said, "we must make up our minds." "Make up our minds?" I said. "Yes, we must recruit our strength. If we husband our little store in order to have a few more hours of life, we shall make ourselves weaker at the last." "Yes, at the last. That will be very soon." Well, I suppose a chance of safety presented itself, and that a sudden effort was necessary. How shall we have the strength for it if we weaken ourselves by fasting? Uncle, I said, when that is a bit of meat is gone, what have we? Nothing, Axel, nothing. But what does it good does it to you to devour with your eyes? You reason like being without energy. Do you not despair? I cried, exasperated at his coolness. No, replied he firmly. What? You still believe we have a chance? Yes, 1,000 times yes. While the hearts beat and the flesh palpitates, a creature endowed with will shall never give place to despair. What a speech! The man could utter under such circumstances was no ordinary mold. Well, I said, what is your plan? To eat what remains, to the last crumb, and regain our strength. It may be our last meal, it is true, but at least we shall still be strengthened to meet our fate. Well, I said, let us fall to. My uncle took the piece of meat and a few biscuits that had escaped the wreck. He divided them into 3 equal portions and distributed them. That gave about a pound of each food to each. The professor ate heartily, with sort of a feverish appetite. I ate my portion with loathing rather than relish. In spite of my hunger, Hans took his moderately, tranquilly, masticating little mouthfuls, eating with indifference of a man who no thought for future disturbed. He had discovered the gourd half full of Geneva. He offered it to us, and vivifying liquor reanimated me to a little. Fortefring, said Hans, drinking his turn. Excellent, rejoined my uncle. Hope revived me a little. But our last meal was ended. It was now 5 o'clock in the morning. Man is so constituted that his health is a purely negative result. Once the desire for food is satisfied, he scarcely conceives the horrors of starvation. To understand them, he must be suffering them. So in our case, a few mouthfuls of biscuit and meat triumphed over all our past troubles. Still, after our repast, each one gave himself up to his own thoughts. What were the reflections of Hans, this man of extreme West, possessed with the fatalism of Orientals? As for me, my thoughts were nothing but memories, and they carried me to the surface of the globe, which I ought to never left. The home in the Königstrasse, my poor Grauben, our good Martha, passed before me like dreams, and the melancholy rumblings that echoed in the rock I fancied I could hear the hum of cries. My uncle, always busy, was occupied, torch in hand, examining the nature of formation. He was trying to ascertain our position by observing how the strata were grouped. Such a calculation could only be a very rough one, but a savant is always a savant. As long as he keeps his self-possession, and Professor Lindenbrock had the faculty had no common degree. I heard him utter geological terms. I understood them, and in spite of myself, I was interested. Eruptive granite, he said. We are still in the primitive period, but we ascend still? Who knows? He still hoped. He felt along the wall, and a few minutes later he exclaimed, "There is the gneiss! There the mica schist! Soon we shall come to the transition of rocks." And then, what did he mean? Could he measure the thickness of the crust suspended overhead? What means had he of calculating? The nanometer was gone, and nothing could supply its place. The temperature rose rapidly. I felt bathed in the burning atmosphere. The heat was comparable to nothing but the burst of the foundry furnace where melting was going on. Are we approaching a burning mass? I cried. At a moment when the heat seemed to acquire a double intensity? No, said my uncle. It is impossible. And yet, I said, touching the wall, this rock is burning hot. As I spoke, my hand touched the water. I quickly withdrew it. The water is burning too. The time of the professor is replied, and only by an angry gesture. From the moment I became the victim of the terror I could not shake off, I apprehended a speedy catastrophe, such that the wildest imagination could not have conceived. First, it was a vague idea which soon changed to certainty that in my mind. I repulsed it, and it returned with an undebated strength. I could not put into words, but some involuntary observations confirmed my conviction. By the uncertain light of the torch, I embarked on some fitful movement of the beds of granite. Something was going to happen in which electricity would play a part, and then this excessive heat, this boiling water. I looked at the compass. It was stationary nowhere. Chapter 44. Yes, it went round and round. The needle turned from pole to pole with abrupt movements, pointed to all points of the compass, and turned as if touched by a vertigo. I was aware that, according to most generally received theories, the mineral crust of the earth was never in a state of absolute repose. The changes brought about by internal decomposition, the agitation produced the great currents of fluid, the action of magnetism tend to shake it incessantly, even when the beings scattered on its surface are not aware of any disturbance. This phenomenon, therefore, would not have filled me with terror taken alone. But other facts, details, quite sui generis, left me no room to doubt. The sounds of denotations became very frequent. I could only liken them to sound of a multitude of carriages driven rapidly over a paved street. It was one continuous thunder. Then the revolving compass, disturbed by electric shocks, confirmed my opinion. The mineral crust threatened to break, the granite masses to close in again, the fissure to close up. Then, poor mortals, we would perish in the close embrace. "Uncle, uncle," I said, "we are lost." "What new terror has seized you?" he said, with amazing calmness. "What ails you?" "What ails me? Look at those heaving walls, the dislocation that is gradually taking place in the mass, this torrid heat, this boiling water, every sign of an earthquake." My only shook his head gently. "An earthquake?" he said. "Yes, my boy, you are mistaken." "What? Do you not perceive the signs of an earthquake?" "No, I expect something better than that." "What do you mean?" "An eruption, Axel." "An eruption?" I said. "Then we are in the outlet of an active volcano?" "I think so," said the professor, smiling. "And perhaps this is the best thing that could befall us." "The best thing? Was my uncle mad? What could he mean? Why is this unnatural smiling calmness?" "What?" I said. "We are caught in an eruption. Fate has thrown us to the track of the burning lava, rocks, and fire, the boiling torrents. All eruptive materials shall be shot up into the air with rocky fragments, amid the rain of cinders and scoria, and a whirlwind of flame. That is the best thing that can befall on us?" "Yes," said the professor, looking at me over his spectacles. It is our only chance of reaching the surface again." I passed all my ideas rapidly in review. My uncle was perfectly right. I had never seen him before, confident and more satisfied than this moment, as he waited and counted the chances of an eruption. Still, we were rising. The night passed in on the same ascending movement. The surrounding noises increased, but all was satisfied. I thought my last hour had surely come. And still, imagination is still such a strange faculty. I gave myself up to a childish curiosity, but I was the slave of my fancies, not their master. It was evident that we were being forced upward by an eruptive pressure. Under the raft was boiling water, and under these waters was a lava mass, the collection of rocks which, on leaving the crater, would be scattered in every direction. We were in the chimney of a volcano, not a doubt of it. But this time, instead of Snaffel, an extinct volcano, it was a volcano in full operation, and I began to speculate what mountain it might be on and what part of the world we might be vomited forth. Undoubtedly, we were in the north. Before its derangement, the compass had never varied in that aspect. Ever since Cape Saknussemm we had been carried directly northward for hundreds of miles. We had returned under Iceland. Were we to make our exit by Hekla or one of the 7 other craters in the island? Within the radius of 500 miles to the westward, I recalled the only imperfectly known volcanoes of the northwest coast of America, eastward, and the only one existing under the 84th parallel of latitude and the Esk in John Mayen Island. Not far from Spitzbergen, there is no scarcity of craters spacious enough to belch forth an army. But what I wanted to know was which one would serve our turn. Toward morning, the ascending motion was accelerated. The heat increased instead of diminishing, and we approached the surface. But this was a local phenomenon, and due to volcanic influences, the quality of our locomotion was quite certain in my mind. We are undoubtedly propelled by an enormous force, a force many times 1,000 atmospheres produced by the vapors accumulated by the center of the earth. But to what perils this force exposed us? Presently, reddish reflections presented the vertical gallery, which began to widen. I perceived, left and right, deep passages like vast tunnels, whence arose thick vapors. Tongues of flame coruscated us as they licked the walls. "Look, look, uncle," I cried. "Well," he said, "those are sulphurous flames, quite natural in an eruption. But if they enclose upon us, but they will not close upon us. Suppose they stifle us, they will not stifle us. The gallery is widening, and, if necessary, we can leave the raft and take refuge in some hollow rock. And this water is still rising?" "Axel, there is no more water, only volcanic, pasty fluid, which is carrying us up on its surface to the crater mouth." It was true. The liquid column had given place to eruptive matters, still dense, though boiling. The temperature became insufferable. The thermometer exposed to this atmosphere would have marked more than 118 degrees. I was bathed in perspiration, but for the rapidity of our upward movement, we should have been suffocated. However, the professor did not put into practice his proposition to abandon the raft, and he was right. Those ill-joined beams gave us a solid foothold, which he could have not found elsewhere. About 8 o'clock in the morning, a novel incident occurred. The ascending movement ceased in an instant. The raft was absolutely motionless. "What is it?" I asked, shaken by the sudden stoppage as by shock. "A halt," replied my uncle. "Is the eruption diminishing?" "I hope not, indeed." I rose. I tried to look about me. Perhaps the raft had caught on the point of a rock and offered a momentary resistance to the eruptive mass, in which case we must disengage without delay. Nothing of the kind. The column of cinders, scoria, and stony debris had itself ceased to rise. "Has the eruption stopped?" I cried. "Ah," muttered my uncle between his clenched teeth. "Your fear so, my boy. Be consoled. This calm will not last long. 5 minutes have already elapsed, and very soon we shall resume our ascent to the mouth of a crater." As he spoke, he continued to watch his chronometer, and he was destined to be right in his prognostication. Soon, the raft began to move again in a rapid but irregular manner, which lasted about a good 2 minutes. Then it stopped. "Good," remarked my uncle. Then 10 minutes we shall start again." 10 minutes! Yes, this is an intermittent volcano. Let us take a breath also. Nothing truer. At the appointed minute, we started afresh with extreme rapidity, and we too had to cling to the raft to avoid being thrown off. Then the pressure stopped again. But since I reflected on this singular phenomenon without finding any satisfactory solution. But then I think it is clear that we are not in the main shaft of the volcano, but an accessory passage where the countershocks are felt. How often this movement was repeated I cannot say. I only know that each succeeding start force was greater, and last like the force of the projectile. During the intervals of rest, we were stifled. I thought for a moment of delight of finding oneself in a Hyperborean region at a temperature of 30 below zero. My overwrought imagination wandered on snowy plains in the Arctic regions. I longed for the moment when I should roll myself on the frozen ground of the pole. Gradually, my senses, weakened by repeated shocks, gave way. But for a protecting arm of the Hans, I should move more than once have my head crushed against the granite wall. I have no accurate recollection of what took place in the hours that followed. I have confused the idea of continuous denotation, of general convulsation, and the gyratory movement of the raft. It rocked the lava in the sea in the midst of the rain of ashes. The roaring flames enveloped it. A hurricane like the blast of a furnace, it fled the subterranean fires. The last thing I recall is the face of Hans, lit up by flames. Then I felt like one of those poor wretches bound in the mouth of a cannon at the moment when the gun fired at their dismembered atoms and are shot into space. Chapter 45. When I came to myself again, I opened my eyes. I felt my waist pressed by the powerful hand of our guide. With the other hand, he supported my uncle. I was not seriously injured, but worn out by exhaustion. I was lying on the slope of a mountain, 2 steps from an abyss, into which the least movement would have precipitated me. Hans had saved me from death, while I rolled on the sides of the crater. "Where are we?" said my uncle, who seemed rather put out by having returned to the surface. The hunter shrugged his shoulders in a token of ignorance. "In Iceland?" I said. "Nish! What? No!" cried the professor. "Hans is mistaken," I said, raising myself. After the innumerable surprises of our voyage, yet another was in store for us. I expected to see a cone covered in eternal snows in the midst of barren wastes in the northern regions, lighted by pale light of the polar sun up in the higher latitudes. But now, contrary to these presumptions, my uncle, an Icelander, and myself were stretched on the mountainside, dried and burned up by the heat of the sun, which was even now scorching us. I could not believe my senses, but I was roasting process my body was undergoing and did not admit of a doubt. We had come out of the crater half naked, and the glorious orb from whom we had received nothing from the 2 months had now lavished upon us his light and heat, and threw around us a flood of radiance. When my eyes grew accustomed to the splendor, I endeavored to correct the error of my imagination. I expected at least to be at Spitzberg, and I had felt it hard to give up the idea. The professor was the first to speak. "After all, it's not like Iceland, but Jan Mayen, perhaps," I said. "Not even that, my lad. This is no northern volcano, with its granite sides and cap of snow. Still, look, Axel, look!" Above our heads, at least 500 feet, was a crater which escaped, at intervals of a quarter and an hour, with a loud report. A tall column of flame mixed with pumice stones, ashes, and lava. I could feel the convulsive movement of the mountain, which panted like a whale, casting up fire and hot air from an enormous blowholes. Lower down on the very steep slope lay the eruptive matter, covering the delicavity 700 or 800 feet in extent, which gave the volcano a height of not quite 1,800 feet. Its base was lost in a basket-like mass foliage, among which were distinguishable olives, figs, and vines, loaded with rosy grapes. Not very like the Arctic regions, certainly. Glancing across the belt of green, the eye charmed with the lovely lake or sea, which made of this enchanted spot an island not many miles in extent. Eastward were a few horses, and then a little harbor, whose blue waves were there rode in some vessels of peculiar form. Beyond these, groups of islands rose from the liquid plain, so numerous as to resemble a vast anthill. Looking toward the west, distant shores sloped to the horizon. On some there stood out the lovely outlines of blue mountains. On another, a more distant hill. There towered a gigantic cone, on whose summit hovered a canopy of smoke. In the north, an immense expanse of water sprinkled in the sunlight too, dotted here and there with tops of masts or the curves of a swelling sail. The beauty of the scene was multiplied 100-fold by our entire underpreparedness of anything of the kind. "Where are we? Where are we?" I kept muttering to myself. Hans closed his eyes and was indifferent. My uncle gazed vacantly before him. At last he remarked, "Whatever this mountain is, it is rather warm quarters. The eruption is going on, and it would be a pity to have escaped the volcano to be crushed by a boulder. Let us go down, and then we shall find out about it. Besides, I am dying of hunger and thirst." Certainly, the professor was not a reflective turn of mind. For my part, I was insensible to hunger or fatigue, and would have remained there for hours longer. But of course, I had to follow my companions. We encountered some very precipitous slopes on our descent from the volcano. We lost our footing among the ashes, and barely escaped the rivers of lava which ran along like fiery serpents. All the time we were coming down, I talked rapidly. My imagination was too excited to let me be silent. "We must be in Asia," I cried, "on the shores of India, or the Malay Islands, or Oceania. We must have crossed half the globe and come out the antipodes of Europe." "But how can the compass?" said my uncle. "Yes, indeed. According to that, we have gone uniformly northward." Then the compass lied." "Oh, uncle, lied." "Yes, unless this is the North Pole." "Well, not the North Pole, but I had no solution to offer. I could think of nothing. But now we were in the lovely vegetation. Hunger assailed me, and thirst too. Fortunately, for 2 hours walking, we came to a lovely plantation covered with olives, pomegranates, and vines, which looked as if they belonged to everybody. And indeed, in our state of destitution, we were not disposed to be too particular. How delightful we thought of that fruit, and how eagerly we devoured the great bunches of rosy grapes. Not far among the shady trees we found a spring of water in the grass, and we bathed our face and hands in the greatest enjoyment. While thus revealing the delights of rest, a child appeared between two clumps of olives. "Ah!" I exclaimed, "behold an inhabitant of this happy island." It was a poor child, miserably clothed, scared-looking, and evidently frightened at our appearance. And in the fact, half naked as we were, and unshaven, we must have looked rather queer, and unless the country was a nest of robbers, we were very likely to strike terror into the inhabitants. Just as the little urchin was running off, Hans went and brought him back in spite of the kicks and cries. My uncle began by comforting him, and asked him in German, "My little friend, what is the name of this country?" No answer. "Very good," said my uncle. "We are not in Germany." And we repeated this question in English. No answer. I was puzzled. "Let us try Italian," said my uncle. He asked, "Dove noi siamo?" "Yes, where are we?" I repeated impatiently. No answer. "What? You won't speak?" said my uncle, who was getting angry. He pulled the child's ears and asked, "What do you call this island?" "Stromboli," said the little herd boy, and fled through the olives till reached the plain. We did not need him. Stromboli! How was I startled at the unexpected name! We were in the midst of the Mediterranean, the Aeolian archipelago of mythological memory, the ancient Stregonoi, where Aeolus held the wind and storms of Amphitrus, and blue mountains curving toward the east were mountains of Calabria, and the volcano that rose on the southern horizon of Etna, the fierce Etna itself. Stromboli! Stromboli! I repeated. My uncle accompanied my gestures and words as if we were a chorus. What a wondrous voyage! In one by a volcano, out by another, and this other situated more than 3,000 miles from Snæfell, and from that arid Iceland, at the extreme end of the world. The chances of the expedition had brought us to the heart of the loveliest countries in existence. We had left the region of eternal snows to the infinite verdure, and exchanged the gray fogs from the frozen zone for the azure bly of the Sicilian sky. After an exquisite banquet of fruit and spring water, we set out again for the port of Stromboli. We did not think it prudent to divulge the manner of our arrival at the island. The superstitious minds of Italians would certainly have looked on us as demons vomited forth in infernal regions. So we made up our minds to pass as shipwrecked mariners. The glory was less, but safety greater. As we journeyed, I heard my uncle mutter, "But the compass, it marked we north. How can we explain it?" "Don't explain it," I said, with a contemptuous air. "That is the easiest plan." "What an idea!" the professor said at the Johanneum, who could not find the reason of a comical phenomenon. "It would be a scandal." As he spoke, my uncle, half naked as he was, girt his leathern belt and spectacles on nose, was once more the professor of mineralogy. An hour after leaving the olive wood, we arrived in Port San Vicentino, where Hans claimed the pay for his 13th week of service, which paid him well a good hearty goodwill. At the moment, if he did not participate in our emotion, he gave way to an expansion very unusual to him. With the tips of his fingers, he lightly pressed our hands and broke into a smile. Chapter 46, final chapter. Here ends a story to which no precedence will be given even by those who are astonished at nothing. But I am forearmed against a human incredulity. We were travelers by the fishermen of Stromboli with the attention due to shipwrecked travelers. They clothed and fed us. On the 31st of August, after a delay of 48 hours, we set sail in Sprepronar in Messina, where a few days of rest made us forget our fatigues. On Friday, September the 4th, we embarked on the board of Volturne, one of mail packets of messageries and pralés of France, and 3 days later landed in Marseilles, having only one drawback to our satisfaction, namely our mysterious compass. This inexplicable phenomenon worried me greatly. On September the 9th, late in the evening, we arrived in Hamburg. I will not attempt to describe the amazement of Martha or the joy of Grauben. "Now that you are here," said my beloved, "I will not want you to leave me again, Axel." I looked at her. She smiled through tears. The return of Professor Lindenbrock, I need not say, made a sensation of Hamburg. Owing to Martha's imprudent talk, everybody had heard of this journey to the center of the earth. Nobody believed it, and now he had come back and they believed it less than ever. Still, the appearance of Hans and some reports received from Iceland were not without an effect on public opinion, and thus my uncle became a great man, and I became the nephew of a great man, which is something. Hamburg gave a fit of our honor. A public meeting was held in Johanneum, and my uncle related history of the expedition, only omitting the facts about the compass. The same day are deposited in the archives of the city the document of Saknussemm, and recorded his regret and that circumstances stronger than his will had prevented him in following the center of the earth, the footsteps of the Icelandic traveler. He had he was modest to his achievement, and thereby increased his reputation. So much honor, of course, raised up enemies, and his theories, based on certainties, were opposed to scientific systems. The question was of central fire. He engaged by tongue and pen in the controversy with the savants of every country. For my part, I cannot admit the theory of cooling. In spite of all I have seen, I still cling to the doctrine of central fire, but I do not deny that certain circumstances, only dimly defined as yet, may cooperate with natural phenomena to modify this law. While these questions were fermenting the public mind, my uncle had great trial. Hans had left Hamburg, and in spite of his entreaties, the man to whom we owed everything would not allow us to pay our debt. He was a victim of homesickness. "Farval," he said one day, and that little word of adieu he set out for Iceland, where he arrived safely. We were deeply attached to our brave eider duck hunter. Even in absence, he will never be forgotten by man whose lives he saved. I certainly will see him again before I die. In conclusion, I ought to add that this voyage to the center of the earth made a great noise in the world. It was printed and translated into all languages, and leading journals extracted the principal episodes, which excited comment, discussion, and attack, sustained and with great animation in believing and unbelieving camps. My uncle had rare facility of being famous during his life, and Barham himself proposed to exhibit in the United States on very handsome terms. Still, amid all his glory, there was an annoyance, I may say a torment, and it was the one inexplicable fact, the compass. To a man of science, such a phenomenon unexplained is a mental torment, but my uncle was destined to be made entirely happy. One day, in arranging a collection of minerals in his study, the well-known compass caught my eye. I took a glance at it, and it had laid there for 6 months, unconscious to mischief and done. Suddenly, what was my surprise? I exclaimed. The professor hastened it to me. "What is it?" he said. "The compass. Its needle is pointing south, not north. What do you say? The pole is changed." My uncle looked, compared it, and then made a jump at the shook of the house. What a light now broke upon us. "Well then," he said, and when he regained his speech, "after arrival at Cape Secusum, the needle of his confounded compass marked south for north. Clearly. Then our mistake is explained. What could have produced such a change in polarity?" "I think it is easy to explain," I said. "During the storm of the sea in Lindenbrock, that fireball that magnetized the iron and the raft deorganized our compass." "Ha ha!" laughed the professor. "Then it was a prank of electricity." From that day, my uncle was the happiest of sages, and the happiest of men, for my lovely Verlandice, abdicating her position of pupil, was installed in the Königstrasse house in double quality of niece and wife. I need not add that her uncle was illustrious Professor Otto Lindenbrock, corresponding member of all scientific societies, geographical and mineralogical, in the 5 quarters of the globe.